Greetings, Kerbinauts! This is Kerbal Space Program. I'm Bob Fitch, and this is episode number 32 of Project Odyssey. Wow, has it been 32 episodes? And I'm still blowing stuff up, apparently. Last episode, a couple weeks ago, we were looking at trying to get our mission going over to the moon again, where we could experiment with the technology that is going to get us the Kethite we need once we're on Duna. We'll be using the Kethite there in order to do things like reorbit our landers and possibly do a little flying around the planet to different locations just in case we need to, for the purposes of archaeology, of course, so that we can get the artifact that we need that's going to get us back to our own dimension. Also, when it's dark on Duna, we're going to need some kind of electrical power source. The solar panels won't be functioning, so we'll use some sort of generator that either operates directly off the Kethite or off of the fuel that gets generated by the Kethite. Either way, it's pretty much the same idea. We'll be turning mass into electrical power. But before we can do that, of course, we need to shake all the bugs out of the system. And what have they been so far? Well, we've had some issues with the new initial booster engines, the ones that go on the bottom of that core there. There's 5 of them. Those are brand new. And while I was setting them up, I was having some problems getting them to the right thrust to weight ratio. I would be in the VAB and everything would look like it was okay, and then we would take it out onto the pad and try to launch it, and it wouldn't launch properly, and so I had to shake out some bugs. And right here I've turned off gravity so that I can test decoupling and landing. And then we're going to go back and try out fixing the engines and getting the thrust to weight just right. In that case, it turned out that it was an interference with the difficulty scaler on the ISP. It was adjusting my thrust down when I'd actually go to launch it, believing that we were either in altitude or not at altitude. I can't remember exactly which it is now. But either way, it wasn't generating the right amount of thrust, even though it claimed that it was going to. Once that was worked out, there were some issues with getting the clamshell fairing to decouple properly. When it would pop open, sometimes it wouldn't fly off the way that I wanted to, and sometimes it would collide with things. So I had this idea that maybe if I put some retro rockets built directly into the fairing so that as soon as you decouple it, they fire, they're going to be welded into it, that might solve the problem. Well, to get them into the right spots and not have to worry about all of the alignment and everything like that, I put these structure panels inside the fairing, and I figured if I weld this together, then I can go into the weld file and remove the structure panels, but leave behind the actual retro rockets. However, that idea didn't work out so well because the solids wouldn't activate when I staged it. And then I thought, well, maybe I can put some structure panels that are welded into the fairing instead, and I can attach the retro rockets after I put the fairing out onto the craft. So I had to flip around the thing that I was using in order to get the structure panels into the right place. That way it would be easy to identify which were the structure panels that I wanted to leave behind in the welded file. By having only structure panels that I wanted to keep and nothing else, it made it much easier. So that's why I had to flip around what I was using for the girders to put the things into the right place. Then while launching on this test flight, I noticed a few problems all at the same time. I saw that there was a little itty-bitty gap in my fairing. I saw that when we got up to where we had to decouple the first stage, we were still too low in altitude. I saw that we had a big gimbal on those engines that I was using by default. Those are new second stage engines, and I didn't really want to put a lot of gimbal on them. What I wanted was to have it controlled by RCS and monopropellant using hydrazine. Also, when the first stage decoupled, there was some clipping that happened with the lower stage and the interstage, so that the second stage's engine was clipping in an unrealistic way. And finally, when the fairing was released, there was some damage to the payload on that try. So we took it up again. And believe it or not, to me, this is an improvement. This was actually better because it only failed once it got up to a higher velocity, and that meant that we were getting closer to only having issues with the aerodynamic properties, and that's much easier to fix. The only real unfortunate downside to all of this was that I needed to start using the SAS mech jab control in order to set my pitch angle in there, because it was nearly impossible to get it to react in time. The frames per second has dropped considerably on this launcher. It's got a lot of parts in it, and the whole thing weighs 1.2 million kilograms. So it was so big that the KSP was just kind of chugging and having a little bit of difficulty running it. But by using that smart ASS window, I can set the pitch value so that I started out at 90, and as it's beginning to clear the tower a little bit, then I put it at 88. And then I slowly pitch it down one tick at a time and just let mech jab control that pitch angle as it slowly tips that nose over in the 90-degree mark on my heading. By doing that, by just a couple degrees at a time, I'm able to get it where I have it going at about 45 degrees at the exact same time that I hit, say, 10 to 15 kilometers, although that would technically be, usually that's what happens. This one was so big that I wasn't able to tip it down as fast, at least at this point. Later I do a better job of it, but at this point it wasn't tipping over very fast, and if I did, then it went out of control and exploded. So instead of being able to get to the 45-degree mark by 10 to 15 kilometers, it was more like I was going in the 25 to 30 range. And that's going to mean it's much more inefficient. And so that's going to mean I need to include more fuel. And that meant experimenting with this triple lower booster version of the lifter. However, it had a lot of sway in that upper stage, and decoupling I knew was going to be a problem. There was going to need to be a whole bunch of extra retro boosters designed to thrust it out sideways. It just didn't seem like this one was going to do very well, so I scrapped the idea of the triple boosters fairly quickly. And after taking it through a re-entry test, I guess, apparently, we then swapped back to using just a couple Ariane-style boosters instead. Although in this case, what I had done is scaled them up to be a little bit bigger. And after that, it was test after test after test after test, trying to find where the problems were, trying to get it to fly correctly, have the right thrust, change the amount of fuel I'm using, change the engine types I'm using. It was wonderful. You might think that I'm crazy for thinking that, but you'd be wrong, because this is one of the things that I really love about playing KSP. I get the opportunity to engineer something, work out the bugs in it, and get it to finally fly. It's like beating a boss in any other game, like an MMO or whatever you want, except in this case, I created the boss myself, and then I defeated him using the techniques that I had available that I've developed over my year of playing the game. So to me, that's a lot of fun. So after all that testing, what it has come down to is using the larger Arianes and a much larger center stage. The core now is the longer version that I have, with the extra white segment and a bit of an orange tank above that. I'm still required to use my Smart ASS to alter my pitch value, because it is, well, this is the version that's 1200 tons now. The limit on this one is low Kerbin orbit. We can't really go much further than that. So there will need to be another launch, another stage, a transfer stage that will be responsible for taking it to the moon or to Duna, whichever it might be, because it just so happens that the amount of delta V it takes to do either one of those things is roughly about the same. If you can just get it into orbit, then you're halfway to anywhere. And as you can see in this case, where we happen to be is halfway into orbit, pretty much. We are done with the lower stage. It has the really awesome decouple retro burn that pushes it off to the side and makes sure that it does not collide with anything. And then we can release the engine protective interstage over those 4 engines that are on that second layer there. We activate those engines, which then pushes us away from the lower stage interstage. The flames on the engine are not ideal, however, I was having some difficulty getting hot rockets to work and I figured I could come back to it later. I'm going to have to launch this more than one time, so eventually I will get that working out the way I want. Although I gotta admit, when we get to the part where it's showing the really big flames, they are kinda cool, I think. It's pretty clear by now that this one is going to make it into orbit. In fact, you can see the moon on the horizon, and that's our ultimate goal, but not until we get that transfer stage up here. We leave the fairing on the payload for this part of the trip because we're going to want to use that fairing when we get to Duna. Also, the fairing is where I have some of the struts that are holding the payload in place. I have some panels that I'm now using for the retro rockets that throw the fairing safely away to the sides, and those same panels are nice docking points for struts. Hidden in between the boost stage and the fairing base was a docking port. We'll come up and dock the interstage or the transfer stage to that soon enough. Right now, we need to take this thing, turn it around, and retro burn it back into the atmosphere. We're done with it. It turns out that it had a little more fuel than I was actually expecting to have. This reminds me that I need to do a vacuum Delta V launch test because with all the modifications I've made to my atmosphere and my ISPs, I'm not really sure what the minimum amount of Delta V it is to get into low Kerbin orbit on my world is anymore. Obviously, if this were stock, it would be 4,500 Delta V, and if it were Ferrum, it would be 32 or 3,300 Delta V. But I really need to try it on my world because mine is really neither one of those at this point. So throughout all the testing I had been doing, I kept noticing on my reloads or whatever it might have been that it kept saying that all of my resources were running out on the space station. So I wanted to come up here and check because I still didn't think that it should have been a problem. It hadn't been long enough. And I knew that there was an issue with the recyclers where sometimes you have to visit the station to make the recyclers catch up. And I wanted to see how it had done. So we came here to take a look and clicked through each of the life support systems one by one and noticed that some of them weren't actually functioning, or at least one of them wasn't functioning. That turned out to be that the recycler was preventing its operation if the destination tank was full. But in this case, it was a waste product that it was preventing generating more of, and I don't mind generating additional waste product that I don't need, because we can just dump some of that excess overboard. So what I needed to do is go back to the config files and modify it so that it would generate the water even if the waste tank for the methane or the hydrogen was getting to be full. Right now, I'm fast forwarding, keeping my eye on the water and the wastewater to see if the change I made to the config file has fixed the problem. The water should be going up and the wastewater going down, and everything else should still be functioning the way that it's supposed to. And as long as that's the case, then we can go and launch the transfer stage for the Duna Harvester. But we will need to come back here, it looks like, eventually, because we were still kind of running a little bit lower on the water after all. After seeing that everything was recycling correctly, I had to wait for the launch window to come around for me to launch my transfer stage up to the craft that's already in orbit. We're watching it as it comes around into place, and once it's in the right spot, then we can launch the transfer stage to go dock to it. Or at least that's what I thought was happening right here. I had finished all of my testing. I had done all of the test launches that are simulations, and this was theoretically the launch. It was going to be the one that docks up and takes us over to the moon. But we will soon discover that there was another problem with it, and so this one, because it was real, it ends up being some lost resources and yet another drain on our fuel supply that is getting dangerously low again. Ooh, this is one of my favorite camera angles where we can see the launch platform, the launch site still way down below us with the air flowing past that fairing really super fast. And then shortly after that, we get to do our decoupling of both the boosters and the core stage. And of course, that's always fun too. Lately, it's even more interesting to watch now that I have the extra ones on the top that make sure that it goes off to the side. And of course, now the fairing on this one has little thrusters too. You can't get enough SRBs. You can see the payload there, but don't get used to the way it looks, because as it turns out, that is not the final configuration of it. This one, as I said earlier, is going to end up having some issues. The issue is there's not nearly enough hydrazine on board to execute a rendezvous and docking maneuver. At this point, all had looked good though. The transfer stage decoupled, we have a camera on there so that we can watch as the orbital injection stage fades away behind us. We can bring out our long-range communications antenna that's a little bit extra ranged, because when we go to the moon, we have satellites there that aren't within that 5 million meter range. So we have the 8 million meter omnidirectional but very high electrical consumption communications antenna that we use. Speaking of the moon, when we get a chance to look over there, you're going to see that I've had to change the orbits of the L4 and L5 satellites. I'll tell you why when we get there, but for right now, you can see that we have just run out of hydrazine. So we relaunch, and this time, I don't know about you, but when you finally get a chance to see it, I hope you like it better than the last one, because I do too. The fairing is about as big as it can get this time because the stage is a little bit different. We're using new engines, we're using new fuel tanks, we're using new fuel. We're going to go on strictly liquid hydrogen this time, and we're going to have nuclear engines. But these aren't some stock nuclear engines, no. These are super powerful, super efficient in space, absolutely useless in atmosphere, and extremely expensive, which means I have to use them sparingly. Besides, we don't want to really be polluting our atmosphere and our Kerbals with that nuclear radiation anyway. They're small and green enough without that extra radiation. There is a really good look at those new decoupling fairing bits with the retro rockets that are sort of built straight into the fairings. Now it is time to complete that burn that gets us over to the moon. And earlier I had mentioned that there was a change to my satellites around the moon. Well, L4 and L5 are no longer in those hypothetically Lagrange points. Instead, they are actually orbiting around the moon. And the reason for that is some kind of inaccuracy in KSP kept making the moon catch up on the L4 one, or the L5 one would just keep lagging behind, or it would catch up on the moon. And whenever it would do that, it would drop into a really eccentric orbit around the moon. And I had to correct that a couple of times, and after a while I just gave up and said, oh, never mind, I'm just going to allow these things to orbit around the moon, and I'll just have one on one side, one on the other, and they'll go in a synchronous orbit to each other, and that way there's always going to be one on one side and one on the other, providing communication on both sides, and the satellites still link back to Kerbin. So there is a chance that I could have things go out of communication, but there is a third satellite, the scanning satellite, which provides a little extra help too. So maybe between the three satellites there, they won't go out of communication. So anyway, you're going to see them orbiting around the moon now. When we go and get a chance to look over there, you're not going to see them orbiting Kerbin at the same altitude as the moon. I allowed them to drop into inclined orbits relative to the moon though, so that they might be able to see Kerbin a little bit more often if they happen to go above and below every now and then, but there will still be, like I said, those opportunities for the moon to block off communications entirely. We'll just have to take our chances. So the Kerbin departure stage is coming in for a docking, and bam, it is connected. We can bring out the solar panels and then watch for the moon to come over the horizon so that we can start our burn. What do you think of that one, huh? We got the 3 nuclear engines on the bottom, liquid hydrogen in that propulsion stage, the new fuel tank. We've separated the nuclear engines from the bottom with that little truss piece to make sure that we can protect against the radiation coming into the fairing area there and damaging any of our delicate internal components. While we wait for the departure stage to complete its burn, I'll mention that you might also see another change. If I happen to be floating around the space station or maybe a couple other pieces here and there, you might see some new golden style handrails on them. And that's because I went and downloaded this new golden handrails mod and took some of those models and retroactively welded them into a couple pieces here and there, and I might continue doing that. That's the cool thing about welding sometimes is, as long as you're not adding new attachment nodes, you can put models in and out of an existing part and it'll still function when you go to load KSP up again. That model will just be there, and you can improve over time the look of your stuff that way if new mods come out and you want to incorporate them.
Survival rate.
How about with 6 centimeters of composite shielding?
With 6 centimeters of composite shielding, the crew simulation shows a 27% survival rate.
Display the list of secondary options. Belay that. Let in some light. And bring up all feeds marked Primary Alpha.
Primary Alpha feeds are available on the main screen.
Give me a status report for all personnel.
Bob is doing a base patrol. Jebediah is in his sleep period on Odyssey Station. Bill is still missing in action. Valentina is doing an EVA at Odyssey Station. Kesla is conducting an anomaly experiment on Odyssey Station. Svetlana is watching an old episode of Project Gateway in her quarters. Joseph is building a new engine in the R&D building. Hadfield is still missing in action. Neil is finishing step 16 of Hadfield's cure in the med lab.
Open a link to Valentina at Odyssey Station. How's it going up there, Val?
Almost done here. I'm checking the last ones now.
What do you think so far?
These new handrails are great! They are much easier to see and seem sturdier than the old ones.
Okay, Grant out. Open a link to Bob's patrol vehicle. How are things looking out there? All's quiet. We're ready for Svetlana's trip. Okay, I'll contact her next. Svetlana, you're cleared to head to the mission prep room. The moon base awaits. It should be ready by your arrival tomorrow.
Okay, I'm on my way now.
Neil, how's stage 16 doing? We've grown twice as much as we need. Soon the only piece missing will be the Jewel mission. Well, everything seems to be in order. Computer, shut down feeds and resume previous display of secondary shielding options.
There's our moon intercept on that reference mission that we're sending to the moon. Any moment now we'll be intercepting the SOI and getting ready to do our retro burn for a low orbit. I had already oriented myself because much earlier, way before we reached the moon, I had put a maneuver node on the periapsis where we'd be passing as close as possible to the moon, and I pulled just a little bit on the retro direction just to see which way I would have to point the rocket. I oriented myself relative to that, and then I deleted the maneuver node because that's all I was using it for, was just to get pointed in the right direction. Once I'm in that position, I simply start the engines up and go until I like my orbit. And with the Kerbin departure stage nearly depleted, we decouple it now and shift it out of the way so that the payload can finally be exposed and begin its descent down to the surface of the moon. This is where we'll finally get to see a really good view of the fairing as it opens up with the 5 retro rockets on each side of the fairing, attached to those plates that I welded into the craft earlier. technically, this is a view of two different landings, actually. The first one is what we're watching right now, and then with that Kerbin departure stage, the second time I had to reload after a crash, and I used it to lower my orbit a little bit more. Unfortunately, I didn't record the second time, so you're going to see the first time right here. But the whole process was pretty much the same thing in both situations, so one is as good as the other. Right here, a little trick I like to use is to put a maneuver node close to where I'm landing, and then drag it out for about as much as it's going to take to lower my orbit down to maybe having only 100 meters per second left of velocity. And by doing that, it allows me to see how close I can get to the landing site before I need to go full throttle. I had started the engines up a little bit and then realized I was still very far away from where I really needed to have them going, so I turned them back off and drifted for a bit more, and then we go in earnest and start throttling them up closer toward full. Since we're flying straight into the sun, we know that we're going to have maximum visibility at the landing site as well as on the craft, so it should be a pretty bright landing here and there will be no mistakes. Now, since this vessel had been over 100 tons when we were testing it on Kerbin, I thought that I might need some extra fuel. So I attached some special drop tanks, which I'm releasing right there. We've drained them of all of their UDMH and NTO, and fired them off down toward the surface, way out of the way, allowing us to continue on with the remainder of the fuel that's in the lander itself. We won't need nearly this much when we get to Duna, because we'll have atmosphere that we'll be using to help slow down with parachutes, but here at the moon we're going to be coming down strictly on the engines. Even technically at Duna, we won't be getting that much, I suppose, out of the atmosphere and the parachutes. For the most part, the parachutes will probably only serve to help with the removal of the fairing. Although we do have those retro rockets on the fairing, we can still make sure that they're clearly away by using the parachutes to slow us down, and the fairing won't slow down, it'll go flying away. And there we have touchdown for technically landing number 1. Like I said earlier, there will be a second landing that unfortunately didn't get filmed, but I'll tell you when we've switched over to the second landing site. This was the first landing site. We got here and took a little look at the surroundings before opening up the cargo bay and bringing down the rover. We're using Kerbal Foundry's treads on this rover. You're also going to notice some kind of weird misalignment on the Infernal Robotics joints, and I think that's maybe why I crashed right here. Notice how it's a little bent right there, and then the game crashed and I landed again, and so here we are at the new landing site, and this time the joints are looking correct. So that's why I'm suspecting that it might have been Infernal Robotics that caused my trouble the first time. But everything looks like it's all in order now, so I go ahead and uncouple that winch so that we can put it into unplugged, undocked mode. If you use the Infernal Robotics and the Kerbal attachment system at the same time, then you can have problems with the joints being misaligned again if you forget to use it in the undocked mode. So that's what I have right here. I have it in the undocked mode, and so we've picked it up and we can bring it around. I've decided I want to put all 4 of my little lander bits on the same side where the entrance to the cabin is going to be, so that if Svetlana comes later and she wants to go up inside the cabin, she can go in there, and then when she comes back out again, be right here, right next to all 4 payloads. The first payload we're going to put down is the drill. We have it tucked up under there, welded together with a tank that can contain the Kethite after it's been drilled up, and all of that underneath an assembly that has some legs that we can deploy right here, bringing it just a little bit off the ground, giving it some clearance to protect against some chunks that might come flying up out of the ground as we're drilling, and hopefully they don't hit the drill and damage it or anything like that. After that, we'll be moving over and grabbing onto our cargo and battery payload. Just some little Kerbal attachment boxes and near future technologies for the electrical pack to get those batteries, although I think I kind of squished them down a little bit using a config file. This one is much lighter than the other payloads that we have, so this one will be very easy to move over and get it into position. This one has a different leg base than the other one did. The other one comes out of the carbonite pack. In fact, most of the parts that we're going to be using for our drilling come from the carbonite pack. It's just that I've redone them all so that anything that deals specifically with carbonite is now going to instead work with kethite, because there is no kethane and there is no carbonite on my world. It is kethite. Kethite has its own unique chemical properties from both of those other compounds from the other mods. And in fact, Joseph is down on Kerbin still trying to analyze the information that he's been able to get about kethite from small deposits that were on Kerbin. So we don't even technically know all of the chemical properties of that compound yet. The chemical formula for it was shown in the last episode. It's also shown in the forums. If you want to see it again, you can go and check it out over there. There will be various conversions that we'll be able to do. And the part that we're pulling down off of the lander right now is a kethite generator. It might function directly off of the kethite, or it might function off of liquid fuel that gets generated after doing conversion. I haven't really decided yet, and it doesn't really matter because I can put the module on it later once I have made that decision. Obviously, the play balance difference between the two is that if I do it as directly using kethite, then that means this generator would be able to work as long as I have it in a drill. But if I have to have it convert into the fuel first, then that means we'll have to have a converter as well, which is what we're going to go and grab as the fourth payload around on the other side of the lander from where we are right now. I suppose one thing we could assume is that maybe this generator has an itty bitty little converter in it that can convert just fast enough to turn the kethite into some sort of fuel and oxidizer that it can use right there, probably like a UDMH and an NTO. But that the generator uses so little of it that the converter is very, very small and would be incapable of effectively converting kethite into UDMH and NTO for any larger quantities than are necessary to run the generator itself. So that way I can just put kethite as the input resource and have electrical charge be the output resource, which should simplify things considerably and give us a really good reason why we want to have that generator potentially be in some situations where that's all we have is just the generator and maybe like a fuel tank attached to it or a kethite tank attached to it and nothing else. We wouldn't need a drill and we wouldn't need the converter in that case. That would also bring it in line with the exact same sort of play style and play balance as the kethane and carbonite mods, because their generators operate off of their custom resource as well. So our little rover is just about done. We're moving that fourth payload into position, lowering it down and deploying those legs, which will then complete this initial base installation. We're going to want to bring over Svetlana like we did last time, but I highly suspect that things are going to go much, much better than they did when I was trying to run with 64-bit KSP using Infernal Robotics and Kethane all at the same time. Oh, and in Kerbal attachment system, none of those were very happy with me having been running in 64-bit. But once we can get Svetlana over here and hook things up, I think this is going to be a whole lot more useful and more fun. Her lander is going to have to bring with her, though, some additional life support systems as well as some habitation areas, because I have been going by a new rule that says exactly how much space I need to have for any extended period of time in space or on a base or what have you. The rule that I've made up states exactly how many cubic feet of internal living space that we need to have per crew member for different durations of flight, whether it's 3 days, 2 weeks, 6 weeks, or even longer than that. The maximum is anything over 6 weeks needs to have the equivalent of 20 times the number of crew in crew capacity. So if you want more than 6 weeks and you have, say, 2 crew that are going to be there, you have to technically have 40 crews worth of internal space, while something that's only 3 days needs to only have 1 crew capacity per crew. Up to 2 weeks is 2 capacity per crew, and up to 6 weeks is 10 capacity per crew. Okay, there we go. We've destroyed one of the stages that we still had floating around Kerbin, and before we close out this episode, we'll take a little look here at the new Astronomer Pack interstellar visuals that I've just recently installed so we can look at the space station. And after that, we can take a closer look at some of those golden handrails that I retroactively welded into the life support module, as well as the living space, the luxury living quarters of the station. Well, that's going to do it for this one. Until next time, I will see you later, Kerbinauts.
Signal strength 80%. Almost there. Try to link the secondary phase emitters. Yep, that did it. Signal strength 97%. Okay, open a link from the command center to Kamalak. I'm giving the order. By this time next week, we should have a stable communications wormhole to Svetlana's new dimension.
Don't tell anybody, but here's some extra special bonus footage for those of you who have stuck with this right to the end of this episode. What sometimes happens when I'm making my little flybys and cinematics and stuff is I'm not really paying attention to how I'm landing, and so I have to do one landing that really isn't about landing, it's about getting the videos and then generally crashing in balls of fire. After that, I reload and I get the less cinematic, more plain view of the landing. But now it's really over. Until next time, I will see you later, Kerbinauts.